The night my wife's brother's new girlfriend called me the unemployed one in front of the entire family, and everyone at that table actually laughed. I smiled, picked up my fork, and kept eating. Nobody at that table knew I had already spent 3 weeks quietly building the exact moment that would make every single one of them stop laughing for good. I need to back up, because to really understand how satisfying that moment was, you have to understand the 8 years that led up to it. My name isn't important for this story, so let's just say I married into a family that never quite decided I was good enough. My wife, I'll call her Marisol, comes from a big, loud, close-knit family. The kind that has a group chat with 40 messages a day and a Sunday dinner tradition that's been going strong since before I ever showed up. When we got married 8 years ago, I thought I was joining that. What I actually joined was something closer to an audience that had already decided, before I said a word, that I was the guy who got lucky marrying up Marisol's father, a proud, opinionated man who built a successful contracting business from nothing, never fully warmed to me. Not because I did anything wrong, but because in his eyes I didn't have a business, a big title, or a big number attached to my name. I still work, actually, as a data analyst for a mid-sized logistics company. Steady job, decent pay, not flashy, and in a family that measured worth in trucks, contracts, and square footage. Steady apparently translated to less than. For 8 years, I sat through Sunday dinners where I was the punchline. Jokes about my boring desk job. Comments about how Marisol could have done better. Her cousin once asked, in front of 15 people, if I ever thought about getting a real job, and everyone chuckled like it was the funniest thing they'd heard all week. I used to laugh along too, because what else do? You're at someone else's table, in someone else's family, and you learn pretty quickly that pushing back just makes you the guy who can't take a joke. I want to be honest with you, because I think this part matters. Marisol didn't defend me the way I wished she would. Not really. She'd squeeze my hand under the table sometimes, or mouth sorry across the room. But she never stood up in front of her family and said, "Stop." I used to resent her for that, quietly. In the car on the way home, the two of us sitting in silence after another dinner where I'd been the evening's entertainment. She'd always say the same thing. That's just how they are. They don't mean it. 8 years of they don't mean it adds up to something. Though, it adds up to a kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones. The newest member of this circus was Marisol's brother's girlfriend, a woman I'll call Dana. They'd been dating about 4 months when she started showing up to family dinners, and within her second appearance, she'd clearly figured out the family spot of let's all pile on the brother-in-law, and she jumped in with both feet, like she'd been doing it for years. The dinner that changed everything happened on a Thursday in early spring. It was Marisol's mother's birthday, so the whole family had gathered. 22 people crammed around 2 tables pushed together, wine flowing, the usual noise and chaos. I remember exactly how it started, because I've replayed it in my head more times than I'd like to admit. Someone asked Dana what she did for work, and she launched into this whole story about being a brand strategist for a marketing agency downtown, talking about campaigns and clients like she was closing a business deal at the dinner table. Everyone nodded along, impressed. Then, because apparently that wasn't enough validation for one night, she turned to me, smiled this tight little smile, and asked what I did. I told her, data analyst. Logistics company. Simple, honest answer. She laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one. The kind that comes out before someone even thinks to hold it back. Oh, she said, so like spreadsheets all day. That's interesting. Then she turned to Marisol's brother and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, no offense, but I could never date someone who just does spreadsheets for a living. I need someone with, like, actual ambition. The table laughed. Not everyone, but enough people that it felt like everyone. Marisol's aunt actually wiped a tear from laughing so hard. Her cousin repeated spreadsheets for a living back at me like it was the setup to a longer joke he wanted to keep telling. I sat there and smiled. Because each year teaches you how to do that on command. How to make your face do one thing while everything underneath is doing something else entirely. Here's the part where I have to be honest with you about something, because I think it's important for the rest of this story to make sense. I let it happen. I let Dana mock me. I let the table laugh. And I didn't say a single word in my defense, because I already knew exactly what was coming later, and honestly, I was almost enjoying watching her dig her own hole. See, spreadsheets for a living doesn't quite capture what I actually do. What I do, specifically, is analyze supply chain data and vendor contracts for mid-sized logistics companies, which means I spend a significant chunk of my week looking at business relationships, partnerships, and, occasionally, red flags in vendor agreements that other people miss. Boring, sure. But it also means I'm decent at connecting dots that most people don't even think to look for. And about 6 weeks before that dinner, purely by coincidence, one of those dots had crossed my desk in a professional context. If you're the kind of person who enjoys watching a slow-motion train wreck unfold because someone underestimated the boring spreadsheet guy, you're going to want to stick around for the next part. And hey, if stories like this are your thing, hit subscribe, because I've got a lot more of them. And honestly, this channel exists because of nights just like this one. So, back to the dinner. Marisol's father, sitting at the head of the table like always, decided this was the perfect moment to add his own commentary. He looked at me over his wine glass and said in that half-joking, half-serious tone he always used, "See, that's what I've been saying. Marisol could have married someone with real ambition." A few chuckles. Marisol's hand tightened around her fork, but she didn't say anything either, and I watched something in her face that I recognized. Because I'd felt it myself for 8 years. That specific exhaustion of loving people who never quite decided you belonged. I put down my fork, wiped my mouth, and finally spoke. Calm and quiet. The way I always am when I'm actually about to say something that matters. I said, "Dana, you mentioned you work at a marketing agency downtown. Which one?" She named it. Still riding the high of her earlier joke, probably expecting me to ask something harmless. I nodded slowly, like I was just making polite conversation, and asked who the agency's biggest logistics client was, since coincidentally, logistics companies were kind of my whole world. She named a company I recognized immediately, because 6 weeks earlier, that exact company had shown up in my work in a very specific and very unflattering way. Turns out, in my day job, part of what I do is flag vendor and partner relationships that carry financial risk, and that company had recently been at the center of an internal review after some serious irregularities were discovered in how they'd been billing partner agencies, including, as it happened, the very agency Dana worked for. I didn't explain all of that at the table. I didn't need to. I just asked, casually, if she heard anything about the account audit that had happened with that client a few weeks earlier. The table got quiet in this very specific way. The kind of quiet where you can feel 22 people's attention shift all at once. Dana's smile faltered just slightly, and she said she wasn't sure what I meant. I explained, keeping my tone light, almost friendly, that there had been some fairly serious findings about inflated invoices and, from what I understood, at least one account manager on the agency side who'd been let go over it. I said I only knew because part of my job involves flagging exactly that kind of thing across vendor relationships, and this particular case had actually crossed my desk. I watched her face do something I will genuinely never forget for the rest of my life. The confidence just drained right out of it. She looked around the table, probably hoping someone would jump in and rescue her the way they'd all jumped in to mock me a few minutes earlier. Nobody did. Because here's the thing about people who laugh along with cruelty. They are rarely brave enough to stand in front of it once it turns around. Marisol's brother asked, quietly, if that was true, if that had really happened at her agency. Dana said she wasn't sure that's what he meant and didn't really work on that account, which, fine, may be true, but it didn't matter anymore, because the entire tone of the table had shifted in about 4 to 5 seconds, from mocking spreadsheet guy to a room full of people suddenly very curious about what else spreadsheet guy might know. I want to pause here and say, I didn't do any of that maliciously. I wasn't lying, I wasn't exaggerating, and I wasn't trying to destroy anyone's career. I genuinely just answered a factual question with factual information that happened to be professionally relevant. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel something click into place inside me in that moment. Watching 8 years of quiet humiliation finally land somewhere else for a change. Marisol's father cleared his throat, the way he always did when he wanted to reassert control of a room, and said something about how we don't need to talk shop at dinner, clearly trying to steer things back to safer ground. But I wasn't quite done. Not because I wanted to keep humiliating anyone, but because 8 years of biting my tongue had built up a kind of pressure that needed somewhere to go. I looked at him and said, calmly, that I found it interesting he'd spent years telling me to stop making the family look bad whenever I so much as raised an eyebrow at being mocked. But nobody at that table had ever once told Dana to stop making her own agency look bad by openly discussing details about ongoing internal reviews at her family dinner. I said it lightly, almost like a joke, but everyone at that table understood exactly what I was actually saying. The room went quiet in a completely different way after that. Not the awkward quiet of someone being embarrassed, but the heavier quiet of people realizing that a dynamic they'd all participated in for years had just been named out loud, clearly, calmly, by the one person who'd been on the receiving end of it the whole time. Marisol reached over and took my hand under the table, and this time she didn't just squeeze it and stay silent. She said to the whole table that she thought it was time everyone stopped treating me like the family's favorite joke because she was tired of watching it happen and tired of not saying anything about it herself. I won't pretend that one sentence erased 8 years of history, but it mattered more to me than almost anything else that happened that night, because it was the first time she'd said it in front of everyone instead of just in the car afterward. Dinner wrapped up early. Dana left first, visibly rattled, practically dragging Marisol's brother out the door with her. A few relatives made some half-hearted attempts at small talk on their way out, but the usual warmth of those Sunday dinners had cracked, at least for that night. And honestly, I didn't feel bad about it. Here's where the story takes a turn I genuinely didn't see coming, and it's the part that still surprises me. When I think back on it, about 2 weeks later, Marisol's father called me directly, which almost never happened, because our relationship had always run through Marisol like some kind of diplomatic back channel. He asked if I wanted to grab coffee. Just the two of us. I said yes, mostly out of curiosity about what he could possibly want to talk about. We sat in a quiet diner near his office, and after some awkward small talk, he finally got to the point. He said he'd been thinking a lot since that dinner, about the way he'd treated me over the years, about the jokes he'd allowed and sometimes led, about the real job comments he never quite outgrew. He said watching me handle Dana that night, calm, factual, without raising my voice or losing my composure, made him realize he'd spent 8 years underestimating exactly the kind of steadiness that actually holds a family and a marriage together, the kind he apparently valued a lot less than flashy job titles and big trucks. I won't tell you it fixed everything overnight, because it didn't. Old patterns don't dissolve in one coffee conversation. And there were still a few awkward months where family dinners felt tense in a new way. But something genuinely shifted after that. The jokes stopped. Mostly, when they occasionally almost started again. Someone, usually Marisol now, would shut it down before it gained any momentum. As for Daner, that turned out to be its own quiet unraveling. It came out over the following months, through the family grapevine the way these things always do, that she actually had been more involved in that account than she'd let on that night, and the whole situation at her agency eventually led to her leaving the company entirely a few months later. Marisol's brother broke up with her not long after, for reasons that, from what I gathered, had less to do with that one dinner and more to do with a pattern of exactly that kind of behavior finally becoming impossible to ignore once other people started paying attention. I think about that dinner a lot, honestly. More than I probably need to. Not because I feel triumphant about it, though I won't lie and pretend there wasn't some satisfaction in it. I think about it because it taught me something I wish I'd understood years earlier. Silence doesn't actually keep the peace. It just delays the moment where things finally have to be said out loud. 8 years of smiling through jokes at my own expense didn't protect my marriage or my relationship with that family. It just postponed a conversation that needed to happen from the very beginning. I also think about it because of what it revealed about the people around that table. Not that they were terrible people. Most of them weren't. They were just people who'd never been asked to examine a habit they'd fallen into without thinking too hard about it. Cruelty dressed up as family humor is one of those things that can run for years completely unchallenged, right up until someone finally sets down their fork, looks up, and decides not to laugh along anymore. These days, family dinners look different. Not perfect. Families never are. But different in the way that actually matters. Daner's gone. My job jokes are gone. And somewhere along the way, Marisol's father started introducing me to his friends as his son-in-law who actually knows what's going on with half the businesses in this town, which, honestly, still makes me laugh every time I hear it, considering it's the exact same job I've had this whole time. Nothing about what I do for a living changed that night. What changed was that a room full of people who'd spent 8 years deciding I was less than finally had to sit with the discomfort of realizing they'd misjudged me the entire time. And that discomfort, it turns out, does more to shift a family dynamic than 8 years of quiet patience ever. I still think, sometimes, about how close I came to just letting the dinner pass like every other one before it, smiling, eating quietly, driving home in silence with Marisol like we always did. I'm glad I didn't, because some humiliations you can absorb forever if you let yourself. But every once in a while, life hands you the exact right moment, the exact right piece of information, and the exact right room full of people who need to hear it, and all you have to do is decide, finally, to stop laughing along and start speaking up.